Hey everyone, today I'll be presenting a topic from Janet Holmes' book, An Introduction to Social Linguistics, specifically Chapter 6, Regional and Social Dialects. So in this presentation, we'll explore how language varies depending on where people live and their social background, and how these variations reflect identity and culture. So this chapter focuses on how language differs even within one language community. While earlier chapters look at multilingual settings, this one turns out attention to monolingual communities. For example, people who all speak English but speak it differently. Holmes point out that our way of speaking reflects more than geography. It is also shows our social identity, including our class, gender, age, and ethnicity. So next, moving on to let's begin with regional dialects. So, a regional dialect refers to a variety of language spoken in a specific geographical area. So, these dialects differ in pronunciation, vocabulary, and grammar. So, for instance, people in Scotland might say, I'll not do it instead of I won't do it. Both are grammatically correct in their own regions, but they represent distinct regional identities. Next, recognizing regional dialects. So people often recognize where someone comes from just by listening to how they speak. They can identify the gender, age, regional origin, and socioeconomic background. So, for example, um, in one of Holmes' examples, a woman named Pat was able to identify a caller, a well-educated young lady from Scotland. Simply by hearing her speech, this shows how language carries clues about a person's origin, education, and even age or gender. Next, we have the regional variation examples. So, here are some examples of regional pronunciation differences. So, for example, in Scotland, speakers pronounce the R sound in words like star and car. In contrast, many English speakers from southern England do not make their speech non-rotting. So even with English pronunciation varies, northern speakers are say bath with a short while southern speakers use a longer sound. In Belfast, vowels sound different too. For instance, bath is like bed. Okay, moving on to regional. Um, Next, we also have regional vocabulary. So vocabulary also changes from place to place. For example, in the UK or United Kingdom, people say traffic light, but in Africa it's called a rowboat. Next, we have New Zealanders called rainbows as gummies, while in Britain they're called willies. So, and everyday words like swimwear have different variations such as dogs in New Zealand. So, this variety add richness and color to language use. Next, we have international varieties. So, moving beyond local dialects, we also have international varieties of English. So take New Zealand English as an example. So New Zealanders may pronounce dad in a way that sounds like dead to British ears. They also have unique words like dogs from swimwear or jandals for flip-flops. These small differences show how English evolves differently in each country while maintaining mutual understanding. Next, we have US British and means versus British English. So now let's compare British and American English. So I have here an example. The two varieties share the same language roots but different vocabulary. For example, we have British as to petrol is American as gas. Holiday becomes vacation, and then also have left becomes elevator. So these differences develop historically and reflect each culture's linguistic identity. Next, moving on to grammatical differences. So aside from vocabulary, we also have grammar also varies between the two. So in British English, you might say, have you got a pen? While Americans say, do you have a pen? British speakers use dived, while Americans say dove. These grammatical differences may seem small, but they reveal distinct language evolution patterns within English. Next, we have other languages. I have here other languages examples. So, dialect differences aren't limited to English. So, in French, for example, um, Parisian French and Montreal French differ not only in pronunciation but also in gender and meaning, such as travel meaning job in Canada but work in France. So in Spanish, there are also noticeable differences between varieties spoken in Spain, Mexico, Argentina, and Paraguay. So this shows that regional variation is a universal linguistic phenomenon. Moving on, um, next, we have the international variation. So, even without one country, there can be multiple dialects. So, in England, particularly around Tennessee side or Geordie, people say this wheels completely disjust to mean we're not. So, they might also say it needs dump instead of it needs to be thrown away. So, such expression may sound unfamiliar to outsiders but are natural to the local community. Next, we also have regional dialects in the UK. So, the United Kingdom is rich in dialect diversity. So, each area, like for example, the Yorkshire, Cornwall, Liverpool, or London, has its own distinctive variety. So, like for example, London's Cockney dialect uses the glottal stop, so bottle becomes ball. Cockney speakers also use rhyming slang, like apples and pears for stairs or trouble and strife for wife. These creative uses of language strengthen local identity and humor. Next, we also have also another one. The United States also has regional dialects, generally grouped into northern, midland, and southern varieties. So words and expression vary across states. So, for example, a dragonfly might be called a snake doctor in some areas, and people might say a fission or a common in rural regions. So each variation reflects regional history and culture. Next, moving on to dialect mapping. So linguists often study dialects through isoglosses, which are boundary lines showing where certain language features are used. So for example, maps of England show how different words like splinter vary across regions. One area might say spill, another area might say spill or split. These maps reveal how language boundaries overlap with geography and social interaction. Also, regional dialects vary by geography. Social dialects vary by class, gender, age, or ethnicity. Language is not just a tool for communication, it's also a reflection of who we are. Our speech tells others where we came from, what groups we belong to, and how we wish to be seen. As Janet Holmes emphasizes, no two people speak exactly the same way. So, next is the caste and social class dialects. So, we will explore how language reflects social divisions, particularly through caste and class systems, and how this division influence the way people speak. So, people in society are often grouped according to social and economic factors. Their language, in turn, reflects these groupings. We call this social dialects. So, social dialects are most noticeable in societies with clear divisions like India and Indonesia. Essentially, a person's dialect can reveal their social background, level of education, and status. Next, the caste system and language. So, in caste based societies, a person's rank is determined by birth and cannot easily be changed. These are strict rules that govern what kind of work a person does, whom they marry, and how they dress, and even how they behave in public. These divisions don't just shape social life, they also shape language. People from different castes tend to develop their own ways of speaking, forming distinct linguistic varieties within one language. So I have here, let's take an example. This is from India. So in Indian languages like Kannada, Tamil, and Tulu, we can see clear differences between Brahmin and non-Brahmin speech. So for instance, we have in Kannada, the Brahmin word for milk is halu, while the non-Brahmin word is alu. And then we also have in Tamil, Brahmins say tongo for sleep, and while non-Brahmins say orango. And then we also have in Tulu, Brahmin dialects are more grammatically complex, distinguishing gender and number, while non-Brahmin dialects are simpler. So these examples show how language becomes a marker of caste identity, reflecting social hierarchy and group belonging. Next is caste dialects in Indonesia, or the Javanese example. So now let's move to Indonesia, particularly among Javanese speakers. So Javanese society has long had clear social divisions, and these are expressed through different speech levels. Language choice depends on who you are talking to, whether the person is older, higher in status, or a peer. And then Japanese has six stylistic levels ranging from humble to high status speech. Then a well educated person might use several levels in a single day, depending on the situation. Next, moving on to here's an example of Japanese students' explanation. So, as a Japanese student interviewed by Holmes explained it this way. So, every time you talk to a different person, you have to choose the right words and pronunciation. Almost every word is different depending on who you talk to. And then this quote shows that linguistic choice is tied to respect and social awareness. So in Javanese, every word choice reflects status, formality, and politeness, showing how language is deeply linked to social behavior. Okay, moving on to the Japanese stylistic level. So here's a simplified look at some Japanese speech levels. So as we can see, there are multiple ways to say something as simple as you or now. So each variation corresponds to a different level of politeness or respect. So the lowest class usually uses levels 1 to 2, and then the middle class uses up to level 3A. Then, and the highest class may use a combination of all these levels. So this means that each group in society has its own social dialect, so defined by how many levels they can command and when they use them and when did they use them. So language in caste societies is a mirror of hierarchy. So the words and styles people uses reflect their rank and social identity. Because caste is fixed by birth, linguistic patterns are also rigid and stable. So in short, caste dialects are example of how language can preserve social boundaries. Okay, moving on to social class dialects. So, unlike the caste, social class is fixed by birth, so it depends on education, income, and prestige. For example, a bank manager, a lawyer, and a teacher usually belong to higher social classes compared to an office cleaner or a factory worker. So, and just like caste, these class differences are reflected in speech. Okay, moving on to vocabulary. So, in England, early studies found clear vocabulary differences between upper class and non-upper class speakers. So, um, for example, sitting room is used by the upper class while lounge is used by others. And then we have the lavatory instead of toilet, sofa instead of settee, then relations instead of relatives. So these words choices act as a class signals. showing who belongs to which social group. Then moving on to the social class and vocabulary. So over time, however, language changes. When non-upper class speakers begin using upper class words, these words lose their inclusivity. So this means vocabulary differences are often temporary. That's why pronunciation and grammar are usually better indicators of a person's social class and their potential to move upward socially. Next, the social mobility versus caste fixity. So let's compare. Okay, so let's compare caste and class systems more directly. So in caste system, we have your position is fixed by birth, so your language use is rigid and rarely changes. And then we also have in class systems, you can move up or down the social ladder, and language use is more flexible. And then in other words, speech in class societies changes along with mobility. And then while speech in caste societies reinforces stability and division. So to wrap up, caste dialects show how language is shaped by fixed social hierarchies. Social class dialects show how language reflects prestige and mobility. Both demonstrate that language is a strong marker of identity. It signals who we are, where we come from, and how we fit into society. As Holmes emphasizes, linguistic variation is one of the clearest reflections of social structure. Okay, moving on to the pronunciation. Pronunciation shows how the way we pronounce words can reveal so much about who we are, our background, class, and even how others perceive us. Pronunciation isn't just about how we say words, it's also about where we came from and the social groups we belong to. Certain speech features, like each dropping, can actually signal a person's social identity. So, in other words, our accents and pronunciation patterns often reflect our education, class, or social prestige. So, I have here an example from the book of Holmes. So, in example 11, so we meet Kim and Stephen having a conversation about pronunciation. So, as Kim says, only uneducated people drop their H. But Stephen responds humorously, suggesting that if you pronounce every H too carefully, you might sound overly upper class or even pretentious. The key idea here is that we speak can trigger social judgment. People often stereotype others based on pronunciation. Okay, moving on to what is each dropping. So what is exactly is each dropping. So it's when someone omits the H sounds at the starts of the words like house, hat, or hub. This is often heard in working class accents in England and is sometimes seen as a non-standard. So, but interestingly, it wasn't always that way. Historically, even upper class speakers dropped the H in words like herb or hotel. This shows that what's proper speech changes over time. Next, I also have here studies from New Zealand, findings by Osha Pragji. So, a student named Osha Pragji studied two New Zealanders. So, Marjorie Lee, who came from an upper class family, and George Davis, who grew up in a poverty. So, the results were clear. Marjorie didn't drop a single H, while George dropped about 83% of his H sounds. Also, this shows that a strong connection between pronunciation and social background. Next, social pattern of each dropping. So, studies in places like West or Yorkshire and Norwich, England also found similar results. So the patterns was consistent. The upper middle class dropped the fewest H sounds, while the working class drop the most. So this regular pattern tells us that pronunciation often reflects class distinctions very clearly. Okay, moving on to frequency over absolute deference. It's, it is also important to note that these differences are about frequency, not absolute rules. So, for example, a middle class speaker might drop some edge, but least often than someone from the working class. So, it's not a yes or a no difference, but a matter of how frequently certain features appear in speech. Okay, I also have here a study from New York from Labov's classic study. So, William Labov, a well-known social linguist, conducted a famous study in New York City. And then he looked at how people pronounce the letter R in words like car and floor. He discovered that the higher a person's social class, the more likely they were to pronounce R clearly. So those in lower classes tend to drop it more often. So this showed a direct link between pronunciation and social status. Next, we also have the arbitrariness or prestige pronunciation. But here is something interesting about this. What counts as prestigious pronunciation isn't universal. In New York, pronouncing R is considered proper and prestigious. Yet, in reading England, it's the opposite. Dropping R is what sounds more refined. This tells that social values shape language and what's correct depends entirely on the community. Next, moving on to the global patterns. So these patterns isn't just in English. In Montreal French, working class speakers delete the I sound more often. In Parisian French, vowel pronunciation marks social class. And in places like Tehran and Mombasa, upper class speakers tend to use more standard forms. And then across the world, pronunciation and clause are deeply connected. Next, I have here an example 15 from the Book of Holmes, New Zealand Vowel Chef. So from here, some speakers pronounce him as hum, Jim as drum, and Pills as pulse. This shows how even small vowel changes can signal where someone's from or what social group they belong to. So these shifts are subtle but they carry strong social meaning. Next, to wrap up the pronunciation, it's not just about language, it's a reflection of identity. So features like H dropping and R pronunciations shows clear distinctions. What's considered as proper speech is socially constructed. It depends on cultural norms. Every community uses pronunciation to express belonging, identity, and even power. So the next time you notice someone's accent, remember, it's not just a sound, it's a social meaning in action. Moving on to grammatical patterns. So now we are focused on grammatical patterns and social variations. How grammar in spoken English reflects a person's social background and class. So language is not only a tool for communication but also a reflection of who we are and where we come from. Sociolinguists have found that grammar, pronunciation, and vocabulary vary according to social factors such as class, gender, and age. So in this lesson, we'll focus on how grammar patterns indicate social stratification or the division of people into social classes. So I have here an example. This is Winna, an 8-year-old New Zealand girl retelling a movie she watched. She said, and then these little flies went to go and they made a house by themselves. Her story helped researchers observe natural language used among children. So they found that lower class children use more non-standard or vernacular verb forms, while middle class children used more standard grammar. So this shows how social background influences grammatical patterns. Next, we have standard versus vernacular forms. So here we can see an example of standard and vernacular grammar. So like for example, I finished that book yesterday. So this is the standard form. But however, in the vernacular, it states that I finished that book yesterday. Then another example is that standard form, Jim isn't stupid. Then in vernacular, Jim ain't stupid. So these grammatical differences are not random. They are systematic and often linked to social class. Next, we have sharp stratification. So from this, the sociolinguist found a clear pattern called sharp stratification. So this means there are strong distinction between how the middle class and lower class speak. Middle class speakers use more standard forms, while lower class speakers use more vernacular forms. These patterns has been observed both in Detroit, USA and North England, showing that this is a global sociolinguistic trend. Okay, moving on to negative concord or the multiple negation. So another is interesting grammatical feature is the negative concord or multiple negation. So take for example, nobody don't want no cheats. We ain't had no trouble about none of us pulling out no knife. So in standard English, only one negative is allowed per clause. But in many vernacular dialects, using several negative is common and perfectly meaningful. So this is more frequent in lower class speech and rarely used by middle class speakers. Okay, next we have um, social awareness or vernacular forms. So now, why is it important? The social awareness or of vernacular forms. So because these grammatical forms also reflected social awareness. Middle class speakers tend to avoid multiple negation since it carries social stigma. Meanwhile, the lower class speakers use it more naturally as part of their community's speech pattern. So the language becomes a marker of social identity and belonging. Next, we have the factors influencing grammar variation. So aside from social class, other factors influence grammatical variation. Social class as the main determinant. We also have the age, or the younger speakers often use more vernacular forms, while the gender most likely men tend to use more non-standard speech. Then we also have the linguistic environment. It depends on the context, um, the usage. So, take for example, people say you got to go instead of you've got to go, depending on the setting or the word's position in the sentence. Then we also have data collection methods. So, to study all these patterns, sociolinguists use different methods, like for example, sociolinguistic interviews. This collects natural speech and background information. Then rapid and anonymous surveys, like for example the Labub, um, like William Amos, where are the women Jews or study in the New York stores, and then from these methods, it helps researchers gather authentic and reliable speech data from people of various backgrounds. Next, we also have the concept of cells. So, in social linguistics sampling, the term cell refers to a group of participants, for example, young males, middle-aged females, and so on. So researchers set quotas for each sale, and then such as, like for example, five people per group to ensure balance. However, one professor students once misunderstood these and thought participants were literally put in cells before being interviewed. So, which of course wasn't the case. It simply means a group category in the research sample. So next, stable versus changing variables. So linguistic features can be stable or changing. So for instance, stable variables, they stay consistent over time, like the each dropping variation and then the multiple negation. So unstable variables show language change in progress. So where new forms spread gradually through a community. Then these changing variables reflect fine stratification. So smaller, more delicate class differences in speech. Okay, to summarize, the way we speak often reveals our social background. And then the grammatical patterns such as the tense, negation, and auxiliary use of strong indicators of class. And then the study shows sharp stratification between middle and lower classes in English speaking communities. Thus, the grammar variation is not random, it's structured and socially meaningful. So, from chapter 6, these chapters examine how regional and social factors influence language variation within speech communities. So, it emphasizes that linguistic variation is systematically and socially meaningful, reflecting the structure and organization of society. Take, for example, in regional dialects, regional dialects arise due to geographical separation and limited interactions among communities. So these exhibit distinctive linguistic features such as pronunciation, vocabulary, and grammar. Dialect boundaries are often gradual rather than abrupt, and then forming what are called dialect continua or dialect chains. Speakers from neighboring regions can usually and understand each other, while communication becomes more difficult across greater distances. Then for the social dialects or sociolects are varieties of language associated with particular social groups defined by factors such as social class, education, occupation, gender, and ethnicity. So these dialects represents patterns of social differentiations and stratification within a community. The chapter notes that language variation correlates with social hierarchy, where standard forms are typically associated with higher prestige and social mobility. Then, for the caste and class dialects, in societies with rigid social structures such as India or Indonesia, caste or class divisions strongly determine linguistic behavior. So, distinctive language forms or registers are tied to social status and movement between these varieties and are constrained by cultural norms. So, social dialects that serves as markers of group identity and social belonging. For pronunciation, um, it features such as the H dropping or the R pronunciations are used as indicators of social background. So, studies in Britain and United States show that social classes tend to use more vernacular pronunciation forms, while upper classes use more standard forms. So, for example, in each dropping in words like house or hat is more frequent in working class speech. So these phonological differences are not linguistically inferior, but are socially evaluated, creating patterns of linguistics, prestige, and stigma. We also have the grammatical variations. So this reflects a social stratification. Research shows that middle class speakers use higher proportion of standard grammatical forms compared to lower class speakers. So, take for example, include the use of verb agreement. So, like for example, she walks versus she walk. And then we also have tense marking or like I finish versus I finish. And negative constructions, like for example, nobody wants any but versus nobody don't want no. And then the phenomenon of this is that multiple negations or negative concord. For example, I didn't see nothing is found in many English dialects and is significantly more frequent in lower classes speech. So such variation demonstrates sharp stratification where clear boundaries exist between social classes. So we also have the sharp and fine stratification, no? So it distinguishes the sharp stratification where linguistic differences between social classes are pronounced, and then for the fine stratification where variation is gradual and indicates ongoing language change. So for the sharp stratification is typically associated with stable features like H dropping and then the multiple negation, while fine stratification often signals linguistic innovations or change in progress. So for methodology and social dialectic, uh, Holmes outlined several research methods used in social linguistics to analyze social variation. So take for example the social linguistic interviews. It is structured conversation designed to elicit both formal and informal speech styles. Then we also have the um, rapid anonymous service. So quick gathering of data techniques exemplified by Labouf's New York department store study on R pronunciation. And then lastly, we have the sampling by social categories or the cells. Diba? Participants are grouped by variables such as age, gender, ethnicity, and class to ensure representative data. So, accurate data collection requires methodological rigor to capture authentic speech and account for both linguistic and social variables. Then we also have the stable and changing linguistic variables. So from this, it differs in stability. So stable variables such as the age dropping, ing variation, then multiple negation tend to maintain consistent social correlations over time. Changing groups showing patterns of fine stratification, and then these changes spread gradually through the community rather than appearing abruptly. Then for the broader sociolinguistic implications, um, th- that concludes the speech is a reliable indicator of social background. Almost any linguistic feature that varies in a community will correlate with social group membership. So stable patterns of variation reinforce social boundaries, while emerging linguistic changes reveal it reveals how language evolves within those boundaries. Beyond pronunciation and grammar, sociolinguists also examine pragmatic features such as tag questions and discourse particles to understand how social meaning is conveyed in interactions. So to sum it up, no, the regional dialects reflect geography separation. And then for social dialects, reflect social stratification and identity. Phonological and grammatical variation, it correlates with social class. And then stable variables indicate long-term linguistic norms. And then changing variables reveal language change. And then also, social linguistic research uses systematic methods to observe correlation between speech and society. Overall, language variation is patterned, predictable, and socially significant. Okay, that would be all. Thank you so much.